Well, first, the main point that the Rizal brings down is that he says over here, he says, "V'havad nechakolo, penya bevayak kiturenu milchama v'nosav gamhu al sanenu necham banu va'alam min haaretz." Right, to be wise with them, and then he says, "V'yisimu alive sari misim laman anasam b'sam v'ven arei miskunot lafar es pisav es ramses." So he talks about being wise with them, and later on he talks about putting. He mentioned like what, to do with the people, and then he comes back and he says, to appoint, tax collectors and to increase the suffering the collectors are going to, the burden that they're going to suffer through. So the reason he explains that really, Pharaoh's not being repetitive over here, but rather he's talking about two groups of Bnei Israel, not one group. But what's the chachma? Right, go ahead. You appoint taskmasters or tax masters, whatever the case may be, and increase the slavery and trick them, as the Medrash points out, that they first offered to pay them and to work together with the Egyptians, and then the Egyptians started to back away. It was just the Jews building up, but they're still getting paychecks, and the paycheck stops. By the time they realize that they're being enslaved, it was too late to do anything about the situation. So there's no. It's not such wisdom to do things like that because basically they're the ones in control. So then, what's the chachma talking? What do you mean to do wisely with them? So he explains that the first time that Paro speaking, the actual chachma dealing with the situation, the chachma is actually talking about the Erev Rav, and the second time it talks about the tax master, imposing taxes and imposing slavery. That's talking about Bnei Israel themselves. Two different groups, right? What is this? What is this? How does he know this? Where's it going on? What's it based upon? So basically, there's a thread going through history that seems to be, on one hand, it's very prominent, but it doesn't get much attention, but really it's very, very central to history and really what's going on in Mitzrayim and the whole Galus and what was supposed to be achieved. It answers a lot of questions, particularly one, why Moshe Rabbeinu, when it comes time in Parashas Bo, that Moshe taking Bnei Israel of Mitzrayim, he insists upon taking the Erev Rav as well. Even though Kosh Baruch Hu told him, suggested that he not do that, because it would be more problems it would solve, it would be very dangerous, and it was in the end that they were the thorn in Klal Yisrael's side. They were the ones who instigated the golden calf, and all that happened after that. All through history, basically, to this very day, that you even hear the terminology Erev Rav thrown today to explain, to describe people who basically are at war with the Jewish people and Jewish destiny to a large degree. So on one hand, we pay all this attention to the Erev Rav. On the other hand, we're not exactly sure who they are and what role they play. Is it just a figure of speech? Is it just a B2 expression we use, or is it mamish the actual reality itself, and why was Moshe so insistent upon taking these people out of Mitzrayim in the first place if they're going to be such a problem? Because on one hand it seems to be on the side. It wasn't the main event, wasn't the main show. The main show is Yetzias Mitzrayim, taking Bnei Israel out and bringing the Yeshua, and the Erev Rav is straggling along. It turns out that there were actually, I think, 3 million Erev Rav. They went out with 3 million Jews. It wasn't a small group. It was a large number of people, which is why there's so much shpiyah. But the basic idea goes back. It's based upon a Gemara going back to the beginning. Back in Parashas, back at the beginning. Just after Adam Rishon was expelled from Gan Eden and decided to do tshuva. So the Gemara in Eruvin says that for 130 years he separated from Chava, and during those 130 years of doing tshuva, and Chava as well, obviously doing tshuva as well, and the tshuva wasn't simply making amends for the chet of eating from the Eitzdas Tov Ra, but the tshuva also was trying to get rid of all the influence, all the effect, all the tumah, or at least as much as possible, that was imparted to them from the nachash, from the snake. So that required a specific procedure, which the Gemara outlines in Eruvin, I guess on Yud Ches on the base. And the result was that they were successful to a large degree, which is why Shais is born basically pure of most of the impact of the nachash. After 130 years, he's still not completely perfect because of the fact that there was no way to go back and undo the chet completely once they were outside the Garden of Eden. But he was as perfect as you're going to get in this world. He still has to die. As the Gemara says in Shabbos, 4 people died because of the bite of the snake, meaning that once we're already outside of Gan Eden, we're already paying the price for having made the mistake, and we didn't rectify the situation, and we put it back in Gan Eden. So therefore, a certain amount of doors are closed off until Yemos and Mashiach. But at least as much as possible, Adam wanted to purify himself of the effect of the snake. Rizal explains. So what happens? So basically, in doing so, everything we do in this world has a totza'ah, has some kind of result, whether it's a positive thing or a negative result, but there's always some kind of totzah. And very often, in the course of trying to accomplish a positive thing, you can actually have a negative result as well. In the physical world, for example, trying to produce soap, and one of the biggest polluters of rivers were the soap manufacturers, and there's big factories to produce soap. But in the process of doing so, all this waste coming out the back of the rivers because that's what they used to dump it before the other more clean means of dealing with the situation. So likewise in life as well, that very often that a person can do tshuva, but very often there could be cost involved. Even just the time element. The person has to spend doing tshuva, and the energy is, it's a positive thing once is a necessity, but better off than to do the chet, not have to waste your time, so to speak, doing tshuva after the fact. And not only that, it's a nace that Hakadosh Baruch Hu even allows tshuva. The Gemara says Adam Marishan after the chet sat around waiting for the world to come to an end. The first time it got dark, the season got shorter, the days got shorter. He thought that was it because logically speaking, it doesn't make sense. We should have a second chance. Hakadosh Baruch Hu gave it to us. Din is din. That's what the Medrash means. When it says that Hakadosh Baruch Hu wanted to make the world according to din, but realized the world wouldn't be able to stand, or understood the world wouldn't be able to stand with mishtatef rachamim at the same time. Put chesed into the picture, and as a result of it, you have tshuva, and we can rectify the situation. So there was a totzah, and the totzah, the net effect of Adam's tshuva, the Gemara explains, produced damaged souls. Damaged souls. I won't go into the details right now exactly how that happened, but produced damaged souls. What the Gemara calls shidim, richim, velili. 3 types of damaged souls. Now the Rizal explains, what's interesting, is that these were actually very high-powered souls. It's just they were damaged.
What were they?
What they're called? They're called shidim.
Shades?
Yeah, like that, but not exactly.
Uh.
Richim, velili. These are the names that Gemara, in fact, uses to describe these damaged souls. What happened to these souls after that all took place? So it turns out that eventually they were megalgil, and they came back in the generation of the flood. They came back as Dor Mabul, which is why they were so bad, why they had problems doing the Rasan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But that's all part of the Tikkun process. They got wiped away in the Mabul as part of their Tikkun, as the Gemara explains. And the next time they came back as Dor Flaga, which the Medrash says, as bad as they were better than Dor Mabul. There's some kind of ilu, there's some kind of progress in the process of tikkun for these neshamas, and instead of being destroyed, they got separated, sent different places. They died off probably natural deaths for the most part. And when they were all died off, they came back another time as a generation of Stom. And even though it sounds like it's going downhill because Stom was completely destroyed, Stom had milas too. There were certain things about Stom, just that they took things to extremes. And because it's in the extremes, they couldn't survive in the world. They were too, just like the Gemara says, the Medrash says, that Hakadosh Baruch Hu was mashtatet chesed to din, right? Stom was too din. It was just too much. The world could be saved with the din of Stom, aside from the other things they were doing wrong as well. But that's why they were destroyed. And as they're destroyed, as a result of that, those neshamas had another tikkun through that as a result. Explains the whole process. And eventually they came back the next time as Mitzri, as Egyptians. They came back the 4th time. These neshamas came back as Egyptians. Now, the problem was who are they? It's not all the Egyptians, just a portion of the Egyptians. And apparently their neshamas, their rectification is extremely important. So somehow history depends upon these souls being rectified, either through their lives, either through their death. But it's not a secondary thing. It's a primary issue that runs all the way through history, that affects us this very day. We're always being affected by the Erev Rav on some level. The Zohar brings down in Bereshis, I think it's the Chaf Hem and Aleph, this lists 5 different types of Erev Rav. And if you look at the description of the Erev Rav that's brought down, it sounds awfully familiar. It's not like it used to be in the old days where they're separate and completely different, but that basically, a lot of what we have today, a lot of what goes wrong in Kleisel today has to do with the Hashpah, the influence of the Erev Rav. And according to the Arizal, for sure at this point in time, they've married and become, if they weren't Jewish when they left Mitzrayim, they became part of Klal Yisrael at some point in time. The Arizal says they actually converted, became full-fledged Jews. They were part of Klal Yisrael. Either way, they became part of the nation over time, and they intermingled. They mixed in. So it's not, you can't even associate. You can't say, well, that's the Erev Rav crowd over there. Basically, all you can do today is look at mitos, look at the way people are behaving, and identify that. So that's an Erev Rav quality. It's hard for us to do that, but that's what the Zohar in fact does. It lists 5 different midot of people, and one of them, interesting enough, it's not so interesting, but amongst the many is for example, is building Bati Midrashas, for the sake of one's kavod. That's a meat of the Erev Rav. Not that you're building it for the sake of Torah and you put your name on it, right? It's just a way of saying, that you're involved in the project, but literally for the kavod itself. And these are things that are not so far, that's not so foreign to what Klal Yisrael has become over the ages. These are the hashpah of the Erev Rav. That's what the Zohar brings down. That's not me, that's the Zohar speaking, right? And the point is that the problem was having to identify and bring these neshamas out so they can go through the final rectification. How are you going to do that? So Yosef goes down to Mitzrayim, right? In Parashas Mikos, yeah.
You gave 4 types. What's the 5th?
I didn't mention the 5th. I only mentioned one of the 5.
No, I thought you mentioned
There are 5.
Four types. You
There
said.
are 5, yeah.
Shadim,
Those are neshamas.
Leilin, and Mitzrayim.
There's 3 of those.
What do you mean?
There's 3 types of those neshamas that came out. Shidim, Richim, and Lilin. Only those 3
Only those 3 are what? Are what?
are the source of the souls.
They're the source of the souls in the Erev Rav?
In the Erev, there are 5 types of Erev Rav,
Uh-huh.
but there are 3. Those are 3 sources. Those are 3 types of souls that came out of Adam Rishon.
They came back 4 times.
They came back 4 times. They came back as Dor Stom. Dor Mabel, Dor Flaga, Dor Stom. The 4th time is Mitzri.
Uh-huh.
Okay. The Rizal says. This is the Rizal speaking. He says the 4th time they came back, since they were on different dargas, not all these neshamas were as damaged as the others. Like there's some were less damaged and some were lightly damaged and were more damaged. He says the ones that were fixed up after the third Gilgul actually came back as Bnei Yaakov. They came back as Bnei Yaakov, and they were the Tukan as much as necessary. Obviously not completely, because they still had problems.
Yaakov, you mean the Shvatim?
The Shvatim, yeah, the Shvatim. And the rest of what that were not fixed up came back as Mitzrayim. And they didn't look much different than the rest of the Mitzrayim. They maybe had some kind of differences, but they were basically living as Mitzrayim in Mitzrayim, and it wasn't so easy to tell who they were. So Yosef is sold down to Mitzrayim. Right? He goes to Mitzrayim, and he's down there in Parashas Mikos. So the Mitzrayim, after the famine begins, they come to Paro, and they say to Paro, "Give us food." Right? We have no food left. So he says to them, "What happened to your food? Yosef warned you. Store the food. The famine's coming. Put it away. Put it away." They said, "We did exactly that. We stored the food, but it all rotted." Right? So we don't have any food left. So he says, "Well, go to Yosef and get some." And they say, "We don't want to go to Yosef and get, because Yosef is making this unreasonable demand upon us to get this food." Right? What is it? Well, Paro says, "Well, if he put a curse on the food, which is what he assumed he did. He didn't do that, but that's what he assumed, right? Then he can put a curse on you as well and do whatever he says to do." So what did Yosef say to do? To do bris milah. Sfas Emes is a big problem with that, but what business does Yosef have doing bris milah? Means what's the point of doing bris milah on all the mitzvahs? What is it going to do? It's going to soften the din, soften the tumah, make it a little bit more kaddish for Klal Yisrael. All kinds of possibilities. But it's not clear as to why Yosef makes a decision. And that's the reason. That's the cost you have to pay to get the grain and get the food. So the reason explains no. There's a very specific reason why. Because Yosef knew that these neshamas had to be rectified. Apparently, they were aware of this. They knew this was a thread going through history. It wasn't simply that we're reading after the fact vis-a-vis the Arizal. It's a secret that's been revealed in our time. But instead, it was known all through the generations for Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, going back to the beginning. And it would make sense. Part of the Masorah, and Yosef knew these souls were in Mitzrayim and had to be rectified, but he couldn't tell who they were. So what happens? So what does he do? He does bris milah, and the Rizal says the moment they do bris milah, all of a sudden a group of Mitzrayim separate out from the rest of them. They actually become a unit unto themselves and begin to hang around Yosef and his family. Now, Yaakov comes down after that because Yosef figures, "What's the hashkacha? Why would a Kodesh Baruch Hu put me in a position like this? Why would he make me second in a mission of Melech in Mitzrayim? I could do all kinds of things. I could make the suggestion. My family could come down. I didn't have to be second in command over Egypt to accomplish the things I had to accomplish for the sake of my family. It makes my job easier, but it wasn't a necessity, right? Why would Paro put you in a position of power? Kodesh Baruch Hu put you in a position of power like this. The Paro makes me the second in command to him. It's amazing hashgacha pratis. When you know the background of Mitzrayim and how they feel about the Jews, you see that later on, the same part where they learn that parsha. When they come down to eat with Yosef, the Mitzrayim won't eat with Yosef and his family because, as the Torah says, it's ma'ed, it was disgusting. They didn't like the Jews. They found the Jewish people to be a low class, population, and they were impressed by them, even though Yosef was doing all these things, but doesn't make a difference. And it just goes to show you the nace. It was totally counterintuitive for the Mitzrayim to put Yosef over the Egyptians. So it was a nace. So Yosef understands. Look at the hashgacha. My brothers sell me. I end up down in Mitzrayim. I work for Potiphar. End up in jail, and through all of this, all this negative, the negative events, I end up to be second in command, and my dreams are fulfilled. All the things I dreamed about, it's all come true. It's major hashgacha pratis. So that's the case. So what's the point? Why would a Kodesh Baruch Hu put me in a position like this, if not to have some kind of major impact on the tikkun of something in the world? So he figures that it has to do with this, and he uses the opportunity to impose bris milah on the Egyptians to find out who the Erev Rav are. And he does exactly that. And they do bris milah. What happens after that? Yaakov and the family comes down to Mitzrayim. How old is Yaakov Avinu when he comes down to Mitzrayim? 130 years of age. Because he's coming down also to pick up, to help Yosef finish the process of tikkun. And these neshamas are being rectified and fixed up by Yosef and Yaakov, the family, this entire time. And the result says they convert, they become part of Yosef's, part of Klal Yisrael, and they hang around. They stay with Bnei Yisrael. So it wasn't like they were external to Klal Yisrael. They were there, right? And, it looked like a positive thing, but they still had rectification to go. So you fast forward, that's like 2239 when he comes down to go at 2448, so for 100 years later. The Shib was like 116 years from the death of Levi until they, 1 year before they finally leave. So it's like 116 years they were enslaved. Yeah.
How does it work with the distribution of Eretz Yisrael? They weren't born to those shvatim, according to this.
Well, by the time they get to Israel, they're according to the Rizal, they're part of Klal Yisrael. They're not part of the Shvatim, but they're part. So they, what they get. I don't know what they get in the end. I don't know what they consider Gerim. I guess they would consider Gerim in the end, and the same thing of Gerim.
Which question? What's this question?
They weren't part of the Shvatim, so how the Erev Rav? So how does the land get divided up later on in terms of Chelik B'Eretz Yisrael? They're not part of the Shvatim. So I guess they're like Gerim in that respect. Same din. That's what I would assume. Never thought about.
What's the 130? Because Yaakov was 130.
Because Adam and Rishon, all these souls were created over 130. This is 130 somehow is associated with these neshamas and their tikkun. So it's not a coincidence that Yaakov comes down at the age of 130 specifically because what's he doing? He's coming down to help finish this process and rectify these souls. It becomes relevant because in this week's parsha you find out that that's exactly what Paro sees. Paro, what's the chachma that you have to deal with Bnei Yisrael? So he says it refers to Ha'am. Right, is talking about the Erev Rav because he says, look, Bnei Israel, you have to enslave. Then you can impose taxes and you can enslave them and make them work and the whole thing, because we don't care what happens to them. In fact, it would be a good thing if they would disappear, and solve that problem, find a solution for them right here in Mitzrayim. But the Erev Rav were once Egyptians. They once belonged to us. So the Rizal explains that Paro was saying over here, if we deal wisely with these people, they'll detach themselves from Klal Yisrael and become Egyptians once again. That's the distinction. That's what he's talking about over here. That's why he makes there's two levels of discussion taking place over here. So now we can understand and appreciate why Moshe Rabbeinu is so intent upon taking these neshamas out. There's another reason why as well, which the Rizal explains. And that is basically that these neshamas actually come from the same place that Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama comes from. They're very high level souls. Very high level, powerful neshamas, but they're mekukal.
Is that why
they're damaged?
Yocheved gave birth at 130?
Oh, so that's why Dafka Yocheved gave birth at Moshe at the age of 130. Because Moshe's whole tafki is going to be to finish off the process of rectifying these neshamas that began back at Adam Rishon's tikkun. Because if you think about it, what he's getting rid of basically is what was damaged in the world. In fact, where does the 130 come from? Actually, it comes from because of the fact that everything in my, just like for example in the physical world, everything is made up of atoms. It doesn't make a difference, not Adam, but that's also true, to some degree, but atoms, right? And you break these apart, it always comes down to some type of nuclear structure where you have you have a nucleus, and you have protons, you have electrons, and these different things that make up the physical world in which we live. Likewise, everything on a Kabbalistic level comes down to Shemos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's all Yud Kei Vav Keis. Everything is just a tzirufim of Yud Kei Vav Kei. The same, for example, you combine different atoms and molecules, whatever, to produce a person, produce clothing, produce a table, produce a wall, whatever you're trying to produce. It's all the same. It's all the same building blocks, just rearranged to produce different things in Ma'aser Bereshis. Likewise, the same thing is true behind that to make that possible. And the entire world, ultimately speaking, is just Yud Kei Vav Kei and different permutations of Yud Kei Vav Kei. So whatever you're doing, you're either enhancing or you're affecting, you're damaging, causing a pagam, causing a blemish to a Yud Kei Vav Kei. And that's we always talk about in terms of tshuva. That's what you're trying to rectify. In fact, the word tshuva actually is the word shuv hey. What's the hey refer to? The hey refers to the hey of Yud Kei Vav Kei. Because when a person does, because the four letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei correspond to the 10 spheres. The Yud corresponds both the Kesser and the Chachma, the little spitz in the Yud corresponds to the Kesser. The Yud itself corresponds to the Chachma. Right? The first hey corresponds to Bina. The Vav, which is 6, corresponds to Chesed through Yesod. And the last hey corresponds to the Malchus, which is the world that we impact. So when a person does a chet, they cause the hey to separate from the rest of the letters. So the influence of the light, the coming down, Kodesh Baruch Hu's light it can't reach the bottom world. So you get Hester Panim the yet. Tshuva means to return the hay, right? When you do tshuva, you rectify yourself and you increase the amount of Or of Kodesh Baruch Hu, Ma'aser Bereshis, it pulls the hay back together with the rest of the letters. So it turns out when Adam did the chet of eating from the Eitz Hadas Tov, he damaged 5 Yud Kei Vav Keis. 5 times 26 is 130, so that's why he specifically spent 130 years trying to rectify the mistake. To rectify the 5 Yud Kei Vav Keis of the Malchus, it's Kabbalistic, but that was his thinking, that was the process. In those days, it sounds very Kabbalistic to us, but for those days, when he lived in Gan Eden, he spoke to Kodesh Baruch Hu. You can't get more Kabbalistic than that. That was his Metzias. He understood these things. That was his reality. Even though he was shrunken down, spiritually became much smaller as an entity, spiritually and I guess maybe physically to some degree, but he certainly retained an understanding of what he once saw. In fact, there's a sefer called, I think it's called Heichel de Rav Yishmael, that mentions that even after he left the Garden of Eden still remained. It was still there. You could still walk up to the border of it, and look inside, and see what we once had, and what we lost. Eventually, when the world became so void of spirituality, eventually it disappeared. It went up or disappeared. More than likely, just that we couldn't see it anymore because you lose the ability to be able to see on such a high spiritual level. It would just sort of disappear from mankind. But it was available. It was there.
What's the 5 again? 5 what? 5 times 26? What is the 5?
That's the 130 years.
No. What does the number 5 represent?
There were 5 Yud Kei Vav Keis that Adam damaged.
Adam did.
By eating from the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. That was the net effect on Ma'aser Bereshis.
What were the 5?
It doesn't mention what I don't know what the 5 are, but that
So he
just mentions
damaged
5.
5, huh?
Right. So that's the 12.30. And that's what he was doing. He was trying to rectify, trying to put it back together again somewhat, whatever he had did by doing the chet of the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra.
Does this have something to do with 5 types of Erev Rav?
Maybe.
There are 5 types of Erev
There are
Rav.
5. That's what the Zohar says. Maybe. Could be.
And when it talks about the hay, it talks about the returning the hay by a mullet who was supposed to be, I think, the first of the Rashis Goyim, is the first of the Erev Rav, is a mullet, according to what I saw in the Zohar. Okay?
Right.
Case Kav. So the hay is missing from case in.
No, it's an aleph missing.
It's an aleph?
It's an aleph, yeah.
It's an
Kisei,
aleph,
so,
yeah.
yeah. But that's part of the same story, just a different letter, just different
There's
notes.
a Vav in the same thing.
There's a vav hey, yeah, that's missing.
Oh yeah, but wait.
That's it's all part of the same. It's all part of the same idea, but it's just a long discussion. That's a shaykh more by Parashat Shalach. But so that's the idea. That's what he mentions. So that's why Moshe Rabbeinu specifically he insisted upon taking these neshamas out because he had a personal kesher to these neshamas. They came from the same place that his neshama came from, so therefore was able to he understood what they were about, and he felt that by going, if you had to wait for another Gilgul, so the tikkun for Ma'aser Bereshis and Yom Mashiach would begin later, which he was trying to avoid. He was assumed that he understood that by bringing these neshamas to Har Sinai, experiencing Matan Torah and being on the Kanfei Shina, that somehow be mashpia on them and make up for lost time. Somehow it have a rectifying effect and save having to go through another Gilgal, and come back another time.
They had a tikkun already of Mila when they were in Shem.
Exactly.
These neshamas, so it's like the same. It's like a similar tikkun.
Why Shem?
You said that was one of their.
No, stone.
Still, it wasn't Shem.
No. There was more of a ruse, but by stone. But there's still going to be tikkun to the entire process. And the bris milah they had in Mitzrayim was part of their tikkun already, which is what allowed them to connect themselves. There was in the beginning. They weren't doing it to fake their way in. That there was a sincere desire to attach themselves to Klal Yisrael in the beginning. There was a shaykhis, but unfortunately, when a person has a damaged neshama, a person goes up the derech and they get pulled in the wrong direction. They have a certain propensity. According to the Or Chaim in Parashat Shalach said he holds a little differently. He says the Erev Rav actually was pretty much created by Paro as kind of like the KGB type of thing. That he sent them along with Bnei Israel to try to instigate them to come back to Mitzrayim, because he didn't know when they left Mitzrayim. He suspected, but it was not clear that the Klal Yisrael was not coming back yet, because Moshe only mentioned the 3 days. So to make sure they came back, he sent along the Erev Rav to unnerve them and to bring them back. That's what the Or Chaim says. But the Rizal says differently. In the end, it is really almost the same idea, because you see in Parashat Kisisa they actually function that way. But that's why Moshe he's committed to bringing them out, to take them, even though Kosh Baruch Hu suggests, and that's why it's not a tzivu. It's like Parshas Shlachucha, right? It's like it's a rare situation.
Did he ask God to take them out? Did he ask God?
I don't know if he asked per se, but it was on his agenda. But they had a discussion about it. That's what the Medrash says. There was definitely discussion, and Kosh Baruch Hu cited against it. But he didn't say don't do it. Because if he said don't do it, then Moshe couldn't do it. It'd be a tzivui, right? So is a Kosh Baruch Hu for it? Is he not for it? It's like in Parashat Shlachucha, same thing. The Medrash says a Kosh Baruch Hu says Shlachucha, Shlachucha. No, I'm not saying you said for yourself, right? So what is it? Is it a mitzvah? Is it a mitzvah to go and send this marag? It's not. It's an avera. We usually, for us, it's black and white. It's either yes, it's a mitzvah, or no, it's an avera. You really get this middle ground where Kosh Baruch Hu is not pleased about the situation, but he's not going to stop you, and it's not an avera. So then what is it in the end? So it's like the mitzvah of Priya, in a sense, right? Men have a mitzvah to have children, but women do not. Because basically, Kosh Baruch Hu will not command somebody to put themselves in a situation of danger. If you want to do it, it's a hexer mitzvah, right? You want to do it. You want to be Moshe Nefesh and help men have the children they're supposed to have. That's great, and the schar, the whole thing like that. But it's a hexer mitzvah. It's not a tzivu, because otherwise, women who'd be afraid to have children or might their lives be in danger, would own this anyhow. But it'll be it's not the way. It's not darchi shalom. That's not darchi noam of the Torah itself, right? So same with Kosh Baruch Hu is by Shlachacha. There's another example of Yaakov going back and confronting Esav. It's a major, episode of Jewish history that Yaakov actually, goes back. He leaves Lavan, comes back, and he confronts Esav, and he sees this. He fights the Sar Shel Esav the night before, and in this fantastic battle with the Sar Shel Esav, which is such a heroic moment in Jewish history that we make a big deal about it. The Torah, kind of paints in a very positive light, and Yaakov wins, and he gets the name changed to Yisrael. The Medrash says he had no business going back there anyhow. Right? The Medrash says that Yaakov going back and confronting, he could have gone south around, the Dead Sea down to Beersheba where Yitzchak was living and avoid the situation altogether. He didn't have to confront the Sar Shel Esav all the way by the Yabuk and then Esav the next day. Maybe eventually would happen, nothing he could do about that, but not right now. So the Medrash says Yaakov's like someone who walks up to a rabid dog and pulls his ear. Esav is minding his own business. What business do you have going in and confronting Esav if it's not a necessity? And yet his name has changed at that time. That whole episode of Shechem falls out to that. So all seems to be a positive thing. So is it a positive thing? Is it a negative thing? Certainly getting the name Yisrael is a positive thing. So maybe we would have got it later on at some point in time. But it all seems to be tied to this idea of fighting the Sar Shel Esav. So is it a positive thing or is it a negative thing? Is sending Meraglim out a positive thing or a negative thing? Is the situation with the Erev Rav, is it a positive thing or is it a negative thing? So basically the idea is that it's a positive thing, obviously, because he gets the name Yisrael, and Moshe seems to be one of a positive thing in the end, but it's Mesukan. Just like having children, it's dangerous. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, sending Meraglim, Moshe had a kavanah. He knew what he was doing. Moshe was not someone who could pull the wool over his eyes. He understood the risks, the dangers. That's why he advised them, and that's why he changed Yeshua's name, and that's why he was like, he tried to prepare them, and it took the best that he could find for the mission. It was certainly well meant in the end, but it was dangerous because for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was somewhat premature, and their godless and their closest to Kosh Baruch Hu was still vis-a-vis Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why Rashi says that there's a hekesh between the going and the coming. Even though it says that they were anashim, ksherim hayu, they were kosher people, and then it says that they're just like they're coming back with Beit Tzara. Likewise, they're going with Beit Tzara. So when did they change? At what point? If they were kasherim and tzaddikim and all that, so at what point did they change? The answer is the moment they turned their back on Moshe Rabbeinu. As long as Moshe was in front of them, and Moshe was there to be a dugman, to be a tzimur for the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they were connected, and therefore they held their level. But the moment they turned their backs and went to spy the land, they weren't spiritually strong enough yet to survive the mission. And even though they may have had the best of intentions, they lost it along the way. And it ties back to Yosef and his brothers as well, which is why he calls them a Raglim Mitem and Parashas Miketz. It's all tied back to the same idea. Because there's a connection between this and that. And what happened to Yosef, happened to Zion. It's all one larger picture. But that's what the Kosh Baruch Hu say. You can send them. It's not an avera. It's even perhaps a good idea, but it's fraught with danger. Same thing by the Erev Rav. Kosh Baruch Hu is the Moshe Rabbeinu. I hear it. I understand what you want to do. I see the potential, but you should know it's a dangerous thing. And it might be better. It might be better given the fresh nature of the Geula and Bnei Israel and their ability to be influenced. So shortly after, within 50 days of leaving Mitzrayim, it's actually 50 days plus, almost 90 days altogether, not to be influenced, with the whole situation. Maybe you're better off to leave them behind. Moshe instead, he descends, he takes them out at the same time. The reason says that's why, for example, you see later on when they after the Egel Zahav is built and they purge the camp, then comes the building of the Mishkan. In Parashat Ba'alosacha, in the Parashat, you have all the gifts that the Siyam brought as part of the Chanukah of Mishkan, Chanukah of Mizbech, right? And you'll notice some of the gifts that are being given are 130 talents of silver. Not only that, but the word Mishkala itself, which means its weight, is made up of, this is the result, not me, right? The Mishkala is made up of the word Moshe and Kuf Lamed. Why? To tell you that this is part of Moshe's tikkun for having got against the Kosh Baruch Hu, who suggested not to take the Erev Rav out, but since Moshe took the Erev Rav out, he's responsible, at least indirectly, for the Egel Zahav, and now the Mishkan, which is his tikkun, this is all tied back to him in the end. That's what he says, yeah.
How do we fit Shevet Levi with the two different kinds of Abdu? One was actual physical Sarei Misim, and the other was the Erev Rav to try and get them back into the Egyptian.
Where they fit into this whole shibud?
They didn't.
Yeah, so they were above it. That's Yosef prepared the way for that. That's why also back in Parashat Yigash, he made sure the Kohanim. There's certain laws were made at that point in time that the Kohanim, so to speak, of the Mitzrayim, to be pater from what was going on in Mitzrayim, the whole situation, was laying the path that the Levium should be able to be outside of the situation and not be part of the shibud. So he was that was part of his forethinking back in them. I mean, but that's the idea. And this theme basically runs through for the rest of Torah and for the rest of history. Ad Kedei Kach, the Zohar brings down that talks about. I mean, you look at what the Gra wrote about the Erev Rav. It's a much more essential reality to Jewish history than we think it is. Than we make it out to be in the end. It's much more part of what's going on historically than we understand. And because of that, everybody has to make sure that whatever they're doing, whatever they're thinking, you have to think twice. You have to make sure that you fall in the category not of the Erev Rav, because everybody potentially can be affected by that reality. To such an extent that he brings down elsewhere in Shar Gulim, he brings down that the generation before Mashiach comes, the actual what he calls Dor Basra, the last generation before Mashiach comes is going to be basically the neshamas of Dor HaMidbar will come back, right? Dor will come back and be the neshamas of Klal Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu comes back in every generation. Anyhow, the Gemara says as well, and the Rashi brings down that every generation there's a natzotz, or the Sham of Moshe Rabbeinu comes back as potential Mashiach in the generation. Ever since that period of time. So when finally Mashiach comes, his neshama will be inside Mashiach as well. The goof, I guess, will be from Yehuda, but the neshama powering that will basically be Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama, because he was meant to be the goyel from the beginning. So That's what Adam stands for. Not just Adam David Mashiach, but also Adam David Moshe. It's all part of the same cheshbon. That's what he says. So, and also the Erev Rav comes back as well. That's the result says. And the Shamas of the Erev Rav come back as well and becomes part of class. So what do you need it for? What's the point? Why should that happen? Back at the beginning, it's understandable because that's what the situation was. For whatever reason, it goes back to the Marishon with the Chet and the rectification over the 130 years, and now he has to finish it off. But thousands of years later, why would that make a difference to history that these Neshamas would come back as well? Unless that is a main theme of history, that this is what is trying to be rectified. So, it's, what do you do with it? It's not like you can sit here and point out, well, that person's Erev Rav, that person's Erev Rav, that person's not, because obviously it's easy to make a mistake. And getting to that, distinguishing one from another doesn't usually serve us well, anyhow for that matter. But basically, there are certain klalim, and one klal, for example, it's one thing to be anti-religious. It's one thing to be anti-Torah, one thing to be anti-Haredi, for example, right? Because people, unfortunately, don't have the proper chinuch, didn't have the proper experience, proper education. They went through, whatever they went through. But for the most part, if they don't see a religious Jew, it doesn't bother them that much, or they won't go chasing after them. They're not at war, right? If you give them their space to do their thing, you do your thing. You want to be that way, and we'll do our thing. Just don't cross paths, okay? Some are more aggressive. They want to, redo the country. They don't want to be. But the moment somebody goes to war against Torah, the moment someone goes to war against the Jewish people, they undermine the long-term national goals of Klal Yisrael. Whatever they're doing, somehow, and it's not that you're not religious. You can also be religious as well and be this way. The bottom line of what you're trying to accomplish, what you're trying to do, does it sustain, maintain? Does it help? Does it facilitate the completion, the achievement of the long-term goals of Klal Yisrael al pi Torah, or does it interfere with them? Does it makir them? Worse, are you at war with the Jewish people? Obviously, somebody who's religious not at war with the Jewish people, but somebody who is not, you're actually going out of your way to undermine the Torah world, to stop Torah, to stop the reality of it. A person can fall in the category of Erev Rav in the end, because that's one of the prime traits. As much as they may have converted, as much as they may become part of Klal Yisrael, the bottom line is the Erev Rav exists to be able to interfere with the completion of the goals of Klal Yisrael. And
this question would you say that anyone who sets up an impediment or is negative Torah, right? These can be identifiable as the Erev Rav.
Potentially, yeah. I'm not saying 100% for sure, but definitely potentially.
Okay, so could you say that where the land of Israel is concerned, that's part of Torah, and therefore
absolutely
anyone who's against the people who are trying to create a greater Israel, that would also be identified as Erev Rav?
What do you mean a greater Israel? To expand the borders?
To take the borders to where they naturally should be. Where the Torah says the borders are.
I mean, to take away land?
No. There are a group of people who are trying to take land of Eretz Israel and partition it off to other nations or other what do you call it? Created nations. All right. So this is land, and there are people here who have a belief that the Torah and the land are integrated. They're integrated together. So by focusing on and having a direct confrontation, a direct war with these kinds of people who are trying to keep a greater Israel, per se, would these people also be identifiable as the Erev Rav?
The ones who are trying to stop it, or the ones?
Yeah, the ones who are trying to stop it.
It's hard to say because some people just follow.
Because you're focusing only on the Torah per se.
I would say more. I would say more the groups that have collected together and spent a lot of money specifically to try to undermine the hold that the Jewish people have in Eretz Israel, the point that they take the position of the Palestinians, that could definitely put a person in the category of Erev Rav. To be in a situation that's what you have today, I don't want to really go into that at this point in time, but to be in a situation today where a lot of it's politics, a lot of it's people who don't understand the great dynamics of Jewish history. For example, a secular politician, he's not living in the world of Torah, doesn't believe the biblical right to the land, and it's more to do with the fact that they're here and they're looking to get peace as much as possible, as fast as possible, and they're, perhaps their distorted way of thinking, they think this is the path to go ahead and achieve this, and to the point that they undermine all efforts from their own people to try to set up, and that's complicated.
I'm not talking about the ignorance. I'm talking about the person who Dafka is preventing, would be the person preventing from this concept of.
It would depend on it would depend. I don't know. It's too broad a question. It depends on the situation. But just the main point over here at this point is just that before a person assumes that there's Erev Rav and there's Klal Yisrael, you have to be very sure you understand the goals of Klal Yisrael to make sure that you're not interfering with them. The Gemara says that's the main battle at the end of history. The main battle, he says, at the end of history is against the Erev Rav. It's not against Yishmael. It's not against Adam, right? It's against the Erev Rav. It goes so far as to say that anybody who is not involved in this battle is better off not having been born b'chlal. He says, because if you're not fighting against them, you're one of them. That's the lashon of the Gemara. That's how serious the thing. And he goes into detail about what the Erev Rav constitutes and how they might look at the end, basically. But I just bring it out just to show you how what seems to be a very secondary theme through history is actually very primary in Jewish history, and everybody has to be aware of the situation. And could I look at the Zohar and see the 5 different categories to make sure whatever mitzvahs they're talking about over here, to try to avoid it, to not be part of it. Because the time comes, he decides who's going to survive, who's not going to survive. It's not so. Mitzrayim 4/5 of Klal Yisrael died in Makas Choshek. You'd be sure that before that Makkah took place, before the actual separation of this 4/5, that many people would never have assumed that they'd be part of the 4/5. And many people would have, the 1/5 would have never assumed that their relatives or whatever. It wasn't like, this family was in, this family was out. It cut across family lines, it cut across, social lines, basically. It had to do with what you were thinking, what you were believing, how you connected to the long-term goals of Klal Yisrael, how you connected to Kosh Baruch Hu, whether you're prepared to be Moshe Nefesh for what Hashem has, planned for history or not. And it's not such a pashut thing. A person to really examine and sit down and think about it, and then make an effort to do the best he can to make sure he's not part of those categories. Yeah.
So, Erev Rav might just be a dynamic process inside each person.
100%.
Instead of looking for
100%. That's what I'm saying.
The Erev Rav is looking.
That's what I'm saying. Everybody has an aspect of this inside. The same way, for example, that physically speaking, some cheres nebal b'klais, the nations of the world, and today there's no clear-cut Amaleki or something, but everybody's got aspects of it. So therefore, for example, you can have like Arab terrorists who blow themselves up, to for the sake of their cause.
They might have, a lot of them have Jewish blood. They were forcibly.
Well, aside from that, but I just say like the idea, as Rashi points out, what's an Amaleki characteristic? Somebody who's prepared to kill himself to get the Jews. He's like, it's totally counterproductive. As long as he can get those Jews and burn them somehow, he's prepared to burn himself at the same time. So that's an Amaleki characteristic that somehow is, it's amongst the nations of the world today. It's got spread out. Likewise, the Erev Rav.
That's his identity.
Erev Rav has integrated itself amongst Klal Yisrael. So it's no longer, one clear-cut people. We all have aspects within us, and we have to take, the war that the Gra is talking about is also, like you're saying, it's an internal war to make sure we're clear of these mitos, especially as history comes to a close. We get to so late in history, it's important to be aware of these
Can
ideas.
you talk about these 5 types?
I don't remember them off by heart. They're like there's Rephaim. There's I'd have to look it up once again. The Anakim.
Anakim is there, but the Amalekim is racist. They're number 1. The fact that it even existed prior to creation.
Yeah.
So they're the most prevalent. They're the strongest.
Yeah, he listed the characteristics. The Gra also listed it. By the way, you can.
What are the mitos? What are the 5 mitos?
I don't remember them off by heart, but you can. I know there's actually one. There's quite a few papers online. You can actually see. It goes into detail with the Gra and other gedolim of the generations.
Could the Haredim be in some cases Erev Rav?
All of them? No, everybody has a potential aspect of it.
When I'm talking about, can some Haredim?
Everybody, the Gra says the reason why they're called Erev Rav is because at the end they'll be Rav, they'll be leaders. It's not just secular leaders, but also be religious leaders too. It's not a pashut thing. You categorize a group, but
No,
clearly,
I'm not categorizing them. You're not hearing me. I'm not categorizing the whole group. I'm saying, can there be
I'm
Erev
saying
Rav
yes.
amongst
Yes.
the Haredim?
absolutely.
And as a result of that, can they see as being part of the Torah, the land is part of the Torah, and as a result of not protecting the land, that could be a meat of Erev Rav?
Yeah. Yes. If it's undermining the goals of Klal Yisrael, the long-term national goals of Klal Yisrael, but it's not always so. You have to. There's rules when some of those goals apply and some of those goals don't apply. So you can't go ahead and start imposing them at times that don't necessarily apply.
Well, some are very
Specifically,
subtle.
specifically,
Yeah.
there's a couple of columnists that work for the New York Times, Jewish, and they were pretty adamantly against Israel all the time. Would you consider those to be
It's very possible.
those
It
characteristics?
could very. I can't. Yeah, 100%. Very possible. See, there's a difference between being confused, right, and calling to question, and examining and wondering out loud and all these different things, and taking into account that maybe it's possible that I might be wrong, but this is the way it appears to me. When someone takes on as a cause, they become passionate about it to the point that they go out of their way to go on a limb specifically to undermine this thing. That definitely could put the person in the category of Erev Rav, 100%.
How about the two guys who went to South Africa?
Went to South
Talking
Africa.
about, the guys that live in upstate New York that went to South Africa and held hands with Arafat, etc. That whole big thing.
Yeah, you are going to Iran,
I mean,
yeah, 100%. That's
what he's
extreme.
talking
That's
about.
the
That's-
extreme
that-
of what I'm
that-
talking
yeah,
about.
that type of
That's
extreme
the obvious
behavior,
side.
you have to be-
I'm
that
talking-
type of
I'm talking
ex-
about the less, more subtle
No,
side.
but
Yeah,
to understand the more subtle behavior, you have to understand the extreme behavior.
yeah. Okay, there's a second word over here.
Could be.
There's a second word. The second word basically is the idea that it's unusual. This is why, part of this was Parashat, but it's unusual. Most nations, when they form on a land. Most people, when they form as a nation, they form on a land. They have a land. They may have collected together. Rome began that way, and America began that way. They began, from the British, they began from the French, whatever. But eventually, they became Americans. So they got to America. Likewise, the Greek. People go to a land. They settled there. Very early stages. They weren't any particular nation at that point in time, but eventually they come together, collective security needs, whatever the case may be, and they form as a people, eventually give themselves a name, they become a country, become a state, become whatever they become. The Jewish people is the only people, per se, that actually became a people outside of a land. They could have been in a land, right, in Eretz Canaan, they were there. They could have stayed there the entire time until eventually the land would have become part of Klal Yisrael's Yerusha, as Kosh Baruch Hu promised, but Kosh Baruch Hu specifically took them out. Took them out and made sure that when they became a people, and the first thing they become a people, the first person to call them a nation is Paro. He's the first one to call them Am Yisrael. To make sure that when they became a nation, they became a nation away from the land. They only come back later on as to inherit, to conquer, inherit Israel, and become. But they're already Bnei Yisrael before they get there. It's Eretz Israel because, as the Rizal points out, the Kosh Baruch Hu folded up the entire land under Yaakov Avinu, who's called Yisrael, so actually the land is in the shape of a person lying down somewhat. Can't exactly see it, but that's what he says, right? And there's probably the unusual shape that it has. And so it's Eretz Yisrael. But really, Eretz Yisrael, as we understand it, is because of the fact that eventually we took over the land and we were living there, but we became a nation off the land. The question is, why was that so important? Why did we have to become a nation away from the land specifically? Right? And what does that have to do with the Palestinian problem today? Because it's very much connected. In fact, as the Medrash just says, based upon the Gemara in Baba Basra, right, where, and I know we spoke about it before, but for those who didn't hear before, that Rabbi Chana they went fishing. They came across what they thought was an island, a fish with grass growing on it somehow, some way, right? And it's a mashal, so this story doesn't have to be true to make its point. And they thought it was an island. They get off into the island. They start to cook. They start to bake. They start to do whatever they're going to do on this island. Eventually, the fish feels the heat. Fish wakes up, whatever, turns over, and they all fall into the water. And they swim towards the boat. They make the boat. They get in the boat. And Rabbi Rechana closes by saying, after telling this story, he says, if the boat had not been close at hand, we would have drowned. Tells the whole story, and thank God the boat was there because otherwise we would have drowned. So Rabbeinu Yaakov comes along and explains what this medrash means later on, in the 1800s. This is before it was even conceivable the Jewish people would ever have a land, at least, the Eretz Yisrael back in their hands. I mean, it had to happen eventually, but not as early as 1800s, early 1900s at that point. And he says this is talking about Achris Yamim. And Achris Yamim, the Jewish people will not only have Eretz Yisrael back in their hands, but they're going to be controlling a people on the land as well. They have shlita over a people. They will think that this people has no recourse. This people will not be able to do anything about the situation, but at some point in time, this people will rebel, turn the plate over in its mouth, like the Lashon of the Gemara by Iyov, right? Turn the plate over in its mouth, flip the situation over, and if Mashiach is at hand, that's the boat, right? Mashiach is at hand, then everything will be fine. We'll survive it. If Mashiach is not at hand, we will drown from the majority of the problems that these people will create for us. That's the way Rabbeinu Yaakov explains that medrash, right? Very significant thing. I remember back in the 1980s when I first got to Israel, the Arabs were there, but they were in the background. In fact, they were intimidated. I would walk down the street and you look at them. They worked in the Makos, worked in the store, drove taxis, but for the most part, they were intimidated. Then you watch the whole thing shift and change, and not just that, but by 1987, the Intifada began. So, we had always been the David, right, up until that point in time. We were David, and everybody else was Goliath, right? Everybody else was the bad guy, was the enemy. Thanks to CNN and everything else that was going on at that time, the whole thing flip-flopped. Literally turned the plate over in its mouth, and with their slingshots, made in Eretz Yisrael, right, their slingshots became the David all of a sudden in the eyes of the world. We became the Goliath. Totally flip-flopped the situation until today, this very day, we're the ones, always the bad guys, no matter how much we do, try to satisfy and make peace, and they do nothing, and the rhetoric right now is going on, doesn't make a difference. The whole world sees the situation differently. We've been drowning, literally drowning for the problems they create, right? Is this stam? This first of all, Rabbi Yaakov is saying that this is an Achris Yamim type of thing, so it makes it very significant. Certainly is taken over the whole world. The whole world has got involved in this thing to the point that, we the amount of international pressure to make peace with the Palestinians, and historically, what was Newt Gingrich, who spoke recently and mentioned the whole thing was basically the imaginary people, the whole thing, invented and the price he had to pay, after having made the statement, which is it's just a historical fact. It's just there in the history books for anyone to read for themselves, but nobody wants to acknowledge that. Totally bizarre situation, which is tied to this week's parsha. It's tied to the very beginning. Why would HaKadosh Baruch Hu form Klal Yisrael this way? So, the Kohen Gadol wore a tzitz on his head, right? Golden tzitz on his head that said, Kodesh L'Hashem. And a person would think that only applies to the Kohen Gadol. Why? Because he's in the Beis Hamikdash. He's doing Avodas Hashem. He can't even go outside, if his relative, if his mother, father is nifter, he's going to stay in the Beis Hamikdash the entire time. He can't go up and matami himself. He's in the Beis Hamikdash. He can't have machshavas. He's got a tahor individual completely. Kodesh L'Hashem. He is Kodesh. He's mukdash to Kodesh Baruch Hu. So a person would say that applies to Kohen Gadol. Not even stam to Kohen, or the stam Kohen, but so not to me. Wrong, because the Torah says in Parashas Yisro that we're mamleches kohanim, and the Kohen Gadol is just the dugma. He's the example. He's the one who we're supposed to look to understand what it means to be a Kohen. Obviously, we're not Kohanim, the Beis Hamikdash, doing the avodah, unless you're a Kohen, right? But as mamleches kohanim, we also have to be Kodesh L'Hashem. And the Leshem goes so far as to say the whole role of being Klal Yisrael in this world is to mekadosh the olam and make the entire world Kodesh LaHashem. Till eventually that's what's going to be Yom Mashiach. All the tumah will disappear, and Techis and Mason, and the world become completely pure and tahor. Same thing is true of the Levium, right? The Levium, Kodesh Baruch Hu says they will not get a chiluk of Eretz Yisrael, right? They don't get a chiluk because Kodesh Baruch Hu is their nachala. He's their Yerusha. That's what they get. Now, one reason is because he was involved with Shimon, in Shechem, basically, and these guys were, together. They did not a very good thing in anger. So Yaakov curses their anger, and Moshe makes a point of separating them. And Shimon becomes school teachers, and the Levium later becomes they work at the Beis Hamikdash. But the truth is that was only true until Levi did tshuva. Because when Levi, by Har Sinai, even before that, but certainly by there, when Moshe ben said, Mila Shemilai, they came and they fought against their brothers, as the Torah Parashas Parshas Kisava points out, makes a big deal about this, and that was a turning point for them. They became the Bechor as a result of it as well. They replaced the Bechor. And as a result of that, the Kohanim, at least from the Levim, and they were Zoiche to become the Misharsei Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim, and Kosh Baruch Hu became their Nachala. Why? Because the truth is, that's the same thing is for all of Klal Yisrael. All of Klal Yisrael, we are not a nationalistic people. Nationalism does not apply to Klal Yisrael. When Moshe Rabbeinu says to Yisrael, right, come with us. In Parshas Shemos, come with us, right? He never mentions Eretz Canaan. He never mentions going east, we're going north, we're going south, we're going to Eretz. Come to the land that Kosh Baruch Hu, he says, come to Hamakom. Come. Why is he talking about this? Because Yisrael says, what's the point of coming to Eretz Yisrael if as a ger, I wanted to chiluk in Eretz Yisrael? I get Yericha, whatever, but I'm not part of the Shvatim. I won't be able to have a chiluk, so what's the point? So Moshe says, that's not the point at all. Everybody's a chiluk in Eretz Yisrael because, practically speaking, we have to have a land to work at, to live off of, and to serve a Kosh Baruch Hu. Not just that, but the Zohar says that since every Jewish neshama, by definition, every neshama in the world, the Gentiles, the Jews, is always hewn from the place, someplace from the world. So what pulls a person to a specific land, says Tuva Aretz, is where the neshama came from. So if a person's neshama was hewn, so to speak, from Canada, they'll be drawn to Canada. From the States, they'll be drawn to the States. A specific place in the States, that specific place in the States. That's what will feel the most settled. All Jewish neshamas, by definition, are hewn from Eretz Yisrael. So you can't have shleimus as a Jew outside of Eretz Yisrael. And not just that, but the Zohar says that getting your chelik Eretz Yisrael is actually getting your chelik of Torah Sheba'al Peh, because it's one and the same idea. How's it work out? It's a different discussion, but that's the basic idea. So there has to be a land, practically speaking, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to make it perfectly clear that He's our land. He's our makom. He's our chelik. He's our nachala. And the moment you put too much emphasis on the land, basically, you begin to act with the rest of the nations of the world, become too nationalistic, and replaces HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which happens for a lot of people, historically. Then you stop in Klal Yisrael, and Israel stops being Eretz Yisrael. In which case, you go into Galus, you lose the entire thing. So that's why if you look in Parashas Azina, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu say? HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that if you're going to annoy me, if you're going to anger me, you're going to act in ways that are not consistent with why I took you to Mitzrayim, to become the nation I took you to become, you're going to Midbar, as opposed to Israel to receive Torah, because you're above the physical reality. If you understand that I am your makom, I am your place, I am your nachal, I'm your Yerusha, if you forget that and you break that, then I will bring against you a non-people. Mina keneged mina. What does a non-people mean? An invented people, not just invented people, but people that are land. People don't. They're not a people. An am is usually associated with a land, with a country, with borders. Right? I will bring upon you. You're going to act in a way that abrogates the conditions of your existence of being a non-physical people, being lamal meteva, and not being overly attached to understanding that Eretz Yisrael is a means to an end and not the end unto itself. Although sometimes it's almost the same thing, but it's only a means to an end. The kedusha, the importance of the land, is the fact that here you can connect the Kodesh Baruch Hu better, stronger. That's the emphasis. The relationship to Kodesh Baruch Hu, that's what the land, where the importance of the kedusha comes from. If you obey that, you will always be connected. It will always be your. And not only will the nation not fight against you, they'll tell you this is where you belong, and no one should touch it, and will protect you. But like the Gemara says in Sukkah, if the Gentiles knew what the Beis HaMikdash did for them, how it protected the world, not only would they not have destroyed it, they would have set up an army around to protect it. If the nations of the world understand with Eretz Yisrael, and the Jewish people living there with the Beis HaMikdash and the Shechin and the connection of Kodesh Baruch Hu, what it means to the world, not only would they won't even go across it to go to war against each other, because they understand this is a whole different Messias. But the moment that we bring it down, it's an amazing thing. One of the most incredible turning points in recent history was at the 6-Day War. Right, in the 6-Day War, it was the moment 6 is introduced into the equation, to a discussion. 6 is always an allusion to Ma'aseh Bereshis, the Vav, which is Gula, Yosef et Tzaddik. In Kabbalah, 6 is the number of Gula. Right, so the fact that you have the 6-Day War, of all the things to call it, is significant. What does it actually mean? I don't know, but it's certainly significant. Especially since so many people, including secular people who witnessed what took place at that time, couldn't help but use the word miracle. It was miraculous. There's no question of, I was too young to know the war at that time, but when I read about it, heard about it, it was mamash lamalma teva, what took place in those 6 days in June in 67.
Those are all the dimensions.
Yeah. What happens, right? I won't mention his name right now, but a very famous general comes along and says, God, he's not in the equation, right? He basically, this is the IDF. The IDF, we won this war because that's how good we really are in the end. And immediately that was like a watershed year. Boom. The 70th war after that, the War of Atonement, that I wasn't old enough to remember basically. We came close, very close to losing the land, losing our sovereignty. Baruch Hu did a phenomenon. He said everybody had to be modeh to in the end. There was no such thing as the IDF was too powerful this time, and it's been all downhill since then. All the pressure since then, because of Baruch Hu, that was a major point for Klal Yisrael to acknowledge and to realize that all the koyach we have as a people, as a nation, all our ability to survive and our ability to be able to rise above the everyday teva of the everyday world is all based upon the connection with the Baruch Hu's Lamal Teva. The moment you place too much emphasis on nationalistic things, like an army and the land itself, and you use that as the basis for your strength, Baruch Hu says, fine, go ahead. See if that works. Tiny little Eretz Israel amongst 360 million enemies with massive countries. Just look at the map. Take out the map and look at the map, and you'll realize what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is talking about. You realize what Moshe means when he says to Yisrael, we're not going to a land, just any land over here. We're going to a Makkah. We're going to the place to connect the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When you connect the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you can redraw the map. All the other countries become tiny, and Israel becomes huge. That's the way it looks. In fact, there's a story of somebody I once spoke to, was on an airplane once, and he said that he was talking, it was a Chinese, it was years ago, like 25 some years ago, and he was talking to someone from China. I don't know if he was a politician like that, but he recognized the keep, and he said, you're Jewish? He said, yeah. He said, Israel, very big country, very big country. Lots of people in Israel. He said, actually, it's quite small. He said, no, very big country. He said, let me draw for you. He takes the napkin, and he starts drawing Israel and the map. This guy, he can't believe it. How can that be? He says, always in the news, always in the front page. Always like this war. How can it be? He said, yeah, that's the way it is. And that's the way it appears. So Kosh Baruch Hu, the beginnings of Klal Yisrael have to be, when you stand as a nation, Kosh Baruch Hu is our nachala. As long as he's our Yerusha, he's our land. As long as Kosh Baruch Hu is the basis of our existence, it doesn't make a difference where you are. Security for the Jewish people is defined as being where Kosh Baruch Hu wants you to be, when he wants you to be there. You could be right next to the conflict, it won't touch you. It could be 6,000 miles away from the conflict, and it will affect you. Chas v'shalom. Because as long as a person lives, so to speak, on a Kosh Baruch Hu, that's his land, that's his nation. A person lives l'mala teva, and the basic borders of the country don't affect him.